Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargava. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. It has now been 4 years since the launch of GST in India, a law which has been considered to be the biggest economic reform of independent India. It took a decade of intense deliberations and negotiations between the center and the states before the GST law could be enacted and implemented. This law has brought about a huge transformation in the levy and collection and administration of indirect tax in India for several reasons. The first reason has to do with the very authority to collect taxes. The power of a state lies in its exclusive authority to levy and collect taxes in its designated territory. For the rollout of GST, the states were required to cede and give up this significant power of theirs in favor of the center. It took a decade to convince the states to give up this power to levy and collect taxes like sales tax, octroi, state excise duty, etc., and to instead authorize the center to do so under a new national law. That meant that powerful state politicians had to be convinced to concede a significant part of their clout in favor of the center. And that explains why it took a decade to do so. The second, the new law subsumed 17 indirect taxes levied by the center and the states. Taxes such as VAT, sales tax, excise duty, service tax, octroi, etc. And these were all merged into one single levy of an indirect tax called GST. After its levy and collection, it had to be then split between the center and the states under a pre-decided sharing formula to be decided by the Finance Commission. This merger or subsuming of taxes, however, did not include taxes on petroleum products, on alcohol, on stamp duty on real estate, which have not yet been brought under the GST ambit and are expected to be done so in the near future. GST thus eliminated the hassle and harassment of compliances towards multiple levy of taxes, hoping to make the taxpayer's life easier, simpler and better, something which we think is still a work in progress. By virtue of formation of a single law, the number of filings and submissions by a business entity collapsed from 495 in number to 12 now, as has been estimated by the Business Standard, thus significantly reducing the burden of compliance for an ordinary taxpayer. Then, GST removed the cascading effect of taxes by merging all these indirect taxes, by merging these tax laws and giving the benefit of input tax to the producer, to the trader, to the manufacturer. Finally, with e-invoices, e-input tax credit, e-way bills, e-filing, linking of GST and customs portals and auto refunds, the onset of GST automated India's indirect tax ecosystem, something that was badly needed. It was therefore expected to make compliance much easier and simpler for an honest taxpayer and also much easier for the authorities to spot and tackle the menace of fake invoices and evasion of indirect taxes, which had been extremely rampant. Upon the introduction of GST, the then Finance Minister, late Shri Arun Jaitley, had remarked that while GST may be a destination tax, which it was, but he said that for India, GST has started a new journey altogether. It was meant to be a shining piece of center-state partnership and a shining example of cooperative federalism in India. The launch of GST as a single pan-India tax was an enormous challenge, and it was thus known that such a massive reform will certainly take many years to stabilize and settle. After all, it was very often only experience that told you whether the law and its implementation was correct or not and what changes it needed. However, it was the hurried rollout of GST that made it a disaster in the beginning. It was, and still is, an extremely complicated and confusing law, and it had been an utter nightmare to the small taxpayers at the very inception, many of whom preferred to shut shop rather than come under the ambit of GST. That explained why many enterprises in the informal and unorganized sector preferred to close down rather than operate under GST. GST entailed the filing of too many forms, which needed the services of an expensive consultant, which many taxpayers, the smaller ones, could also not afford. The biggest drawback was that its key feature was an auto credit for input tax, which often did not work out in that manner. Because of that, taxpayers were troubled and harassed with unwanted and incorrect tax liabilities. While the big corporates, with their battery of consultants, adopted GST quite easily, it is the small ones who struggled enormously. The hurried implementation of GST was further evident from the overestimated future GST collections, which failed to meet their targets, and that saddled the government with a huge liability towards its guaranteed compensation to the states on account of shortage in GST collections. It was this guarantee of compensation which had primarily motivated the states to come on board, and this is where the government was facing a shortfall and a default also. Further, what was expected to give a major boost to the Indian economy by simplifying the indirect tax law and transforming India into a one tax, one market zone failed to do so. In the initial years, it was estimated to have eroded India's GDP growth almost by 1% a year instead of augmenting it. That is reflected in the consistent fall in India's GDP growth rate from 2017 onwards. The unwanted complications and complexities in the GST code and its many compliances caused huge hardship to India's informal, unorganized and MSME sector, and the Indian economy actually hit a roadblock on account of GST, and we think that it was because of its hurried rollout, which could have been delayed till things were sorted out. These sectors, which is MSME, etc., are yet to recover from the initial damage caused by GST. The cardinal error that the government committed was in not introducing a robust and simple GST law with an easy and uncomplicated compliance, and to then expand the GST ambit later on based on its experience, based on the acceptance of GST by the taxpayers and their getting used to compliance. Only after it had settled down and stabilized, it should have been expanded and made more sophisticated. The initial should have been a simple one. The government did not do that. The government erroneously began the GST with a big bang as it thought, and that ironically only got it loud protests and stiff opposition from the taxpayers. Over the years, since its inception in 2017, the GST law has continuously evolved due to frequent changes and amendments and a massive amount of tinkering with the system, which has often brought in more confusion than clarity to the taxpayers. The law continues to evolve and remains a work in progress, and to us, it is still far away from being what they used to call a good and simple tax, and that has not happened, even though it was promised to be so. And we still think that the hurried rollout of the Act was one of the reasons for this. Nevertheless, it has been 4 years of the GST law, and it has now relatively stabilized as compared to what it was at its inception, even though there has been reluctant acceptance of GST by the taxpayers, and perhaps as we are seeing now, even by the states too, who regret the fact at times that they repose faith in the center and ceded their wide powers to levy and collect taxes to the center. The recent relationship between the states and the center perhaps has made the states think so, particularly those in the opposition rule. As per the finance minister, 66 crore GST returns have been filed till 21st June 2021, and that for the past 8 months now, the GST collections in India have crossed a monthly figure of 1 lakh crore. Thus, the finance minister claims and thinks that the GST collections too have now stabilized. Return filing has stabilized, collections have stabilized according to the finance minister. On the 4th anniversary of GST, the Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi said that GST is a milestone in the economic landscape of India as it had decreased the number of taxes, the compliance burden and the overall burden on citizens which is posed by indirect taxes. In respect of GST, on the occasion of the 4th anniversary, the finance minister said that most challenges in providing stability to the tax regime have now been overcome, including those that were posed by the COVID pandemic. She pointed out that the GST taxpayer base has doubled to 1.28 crore in number. the monthly GST tax collections have crossed 1 lakh crores for the 8th month in a row, and collections in the month of April 21 touched a record 1.41 lakh crores. And that, going forward, the enhanced GST collections in recent months should be the new normal now, according to the Finance Minister. The FM rightly said that any economic reform of this scale in a diverse and large country like ours can only be highly challenging. And the fact is, because of that, it will continue to evolve, hoping that it will get better and better as the years go by. The GST law, after 4 years of relentless changes and amendments, is yet to become, as we said, a good and simple tax, and it thus remains a work in progress. Its unfinished agenda is on many fronts, and that, according to us, includes a number of key issues. The first one, to us, there still remains immense scope to simplify the law and its compliance for the small taxpayer in particular. Subtle and simple forms are needed for them, devoid of the huge and big complexities that apply to the big ones and which are needed for the big ones. But for the small ones, you need simplicity, you need simple forms and not the voluminous ones that are given to them. The second, in its zeal to collect taxes, the system often denies input tax credit to the taxpayer, thereby either blocking his tax refunds or compelling him to pay tax that is not due. That needs to be sorted out immediately in order to repose faith of the taxpayer in the system. The third one, reducing the multiplicity of tax rate slabs will add to the ease of compliance and a sense of fairness of GST. We have 5 slab tax rates, it can be brought down to 2 or 3. It will also reduce the volatility in tax collection that we see at the moment. The fourth one, the disputes under the GST law have been mounting. A GST appellate tribunal is needed, or else the taxpayers are forced to go to the high courts for the smallest of disputes, and that needs to be avoided. The fifth one, what we think is needed to be done, is that ad hoc and frequent changes in the law through innumerable amendments, rules, notification, circulars, etc., these need to be minimized. They only add to the confusion and builds taxpayer resentment, which should be avoided. The taxpayer base needs to be broadened, and that can be done by bringing in more sectors in the GST fold. And finally, the center needs to sort out the pending issue of compensation to the states in a more generous and fair manner, and it must live up to the commitment that it gave to the states when GST was enacted, which is guaranteed returns. The center needs to be honorable and live up to it. The larger picture that remains is that the biggest threat to any tax law is the buildup of complexities, difficult compliances, and resultant tax disputes. With the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of experience, the government could have avoided these pitfalls of complexities, etc., and made the GST into a robust and simple law when it was introduced in 2017 itself. But that's not been so, and probably it will never be so. After all, 4 years of complications have already been imprinted on the GST law, and now undoing them will not happen. I think we are certainly destined to live with a complicated law, but we hope the compliance is made simpler so that the small taxpayer does not suffer the burden of it. This is Akhilesh Bhargava signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.